4 centuries collapsed into one night, and history flinched. From chains cutting into wrists on an Atlantic deck to a sleepless dawn in Ouagadougou, grief, revolt, and power converged with alarming speed, compressing generations of silence into a single moment of choice. What does it mean for you when Ibrahim Traoré treats a broken lineage not as symbolism, not as ceremony, but as unfinished business that can still be acted on, here and now? If this premise holds, the map of identity, power, and belonging does not merely shift, it redraws itself in real time. You are about to hear an account that most public conversations avoid, not because it is implausible, but because it unsettles comfortable narratives on power, history, and separation. You will gain a clear lens on how long-engineered distance still shapes identity, influence, and opportunity across the Atlantic today. This is not material for passive listening. If you stop here, the story remains framed as emotion without structure, inspiration without consequence, and symbolism without leverage. You would miss how private decisions quietly became coordinated action, and how coordination began to alter incentives that had looked immovable for decades. You would also miss why some institutions reacted with unease rather than applause, and why that reaction matters more than the speeches that followed. Staying with this means understanding not just what was said, but why timing, sequence, and response transformed words into posture. It means seeing how individual success can be redirected into collective capacity, and why that redirection challenges arrangements that depend on fragmentation. This is the difference between witnessing a moving story and grasping a structural shift already in motion. The initial truth was quieter than the speeches that followed, and more unsettling because of it. The separation between Africans and African Americans was not an accident of time, but a condition that had been actively preserved. Once that lens snapped into focus, actions that once looked symbolic began to read like pressure points. One figure makes the shift tangible. Within months of private outreach, more than 800 highly accomplished professionals across science, finance, technology, medicine, and education were already in direct contact, coordinating without publicity. Without institutions mediating the relationship, that scale matters because it moves the story from sentiment to capacity. The backdrop explains why this mattered so much. For generations, the Atlantic divide functioned as more than geography. It structured labor flows, capital accumulation, and political leverage. Africa was positioned as a source of extraction, while the diaspora was absorbed into systems that rewarded individual success but discouraged collective alignment. Each side learned to survive separately, never to recombine. When coordination did appear, it was often filtered through aid, charity, or state diplomacy, channels that diluted agency and slowed momentum. Against that background, Ibrahim Traoré entered the picture at a moment of instability rather than calm. Burkina Faso faced security threats, external pressure, and internal uncertainty, leaving little room for symbolic projects. Yet that instability also stripped away pretense. The question was not how to look legitimate, but how to build resilience quickly. Reconnection was framed not as nostalgia, but as an efficiency problem. Skills existed, capital existed, and trust could be rebuilt faster than institutions assumed. The seriousness became clear in who reacted first. It was not the communities involved, who responded with urgency and recognition, but established actors accustomed to managing development flows and narrative authority. Their discomfort signaled that something had crossed an invisible line, from personal reconnection into systemic implication. By the end of this phase, the story was no longer about memory or symbolism. It was about whether a long-enforced distance could still function once people on both sides began acting as if it no longer applied. At this stage, the story needed a guide, someone positioned close enough to the center to read the signals before they reached headlines. That role emerged through a mix of leadership perspective and lived exposure to pressure, rather than through formal authority alone. The value was not charisma, but orientation, an ability to see how small decisions triggered outsized reactions. Early signs appeared quickly. Conversations that began as exploratory calls turned into concrete planning sessions, and planning sessions into commitments measured in months rather than years. What stood out was not enthusiasm, but discipline. Participants spoke less about identity and more about logistics, timelines, and friction points. That shift signaled seriousness. When people move from asking whether something is meaningful to asking how fast it can be implemented, momentum has already changed. A second confirmation came from repetition. Similar responses surfaced from different sectors and cities without coordination. Engineers raised the same bottlenecks as doctors. Financial planners flagged the same constraints as educators. Separate paths were converging on the same conclusion. Working independently had reached diminishing returns, while coordinated effort unlocked scale that none of them could reach alone. This was also where risk became visible. External scrutiny increased before any public announcement, a reminder that influence is often detected long before it is declared. The attention itself functioned as feedback, signaling that what looked small from the inside was already registering on larger radars. The guide's role, then, was not to accelerate blindly, but to read these early impacts as proof of concept. The experiment was no longer hypothetical. It had begun to exert force, and once force appears, restraint becomes as important as ambition. The trigger came without ceremony, but it was unmistakable. Private calls multiplied, calendars filled, silence disappeared. What had been scattered curiosity tightened into intent. In the first phase, activation moved fast and quietly. Messages that once asked whether reconnection was possible shifted into what could be built first. Ibrahim Traoré was no longer listening for inspiration, he was mapping sequence. Who could move quickly? Who could relocate? Who could fund without spectacle? The point of no return arrived when timelines replaced ideas. When people stop theorizing and start reserving months of their lives, something irreversible has begun. The second phase escalated with a speed that surprised even those involved. Commitments stacked on commitments. One project unlocked another. A technical discussion revealed a financing gap, which revealed a regulatory workaround, which revealed a human bottleneck that only trust could solve. Momentum compressed decision cycles. What would normally take years unfolded in weeks. Pressure rose, not from conflict alone, but from acceleration itself. Rapid coordination exposed inefficiencies that slower systems had learned to tolerate. This was also when reactions diversified. Some actors leaned in, sensing opportunity. Others hesitated, unsure whether alignment would last. A third group resisted outright. Questions appeared that had not been asked before. Who authorized this? Who benefits? Who loses influence if this succeeds? These questions were not neutral. They marked a transition from curiosity to concern. Then came the aftershock phase, heavier and more revealing. The effects were no longer internal. External scrutiny intensified. Meetings were requested without context. Processes that had been dormant were suddenly reopened. None of this stopped the movement, but it changed its temperature. The work became colder, more precise, less forgiving of error. Enthusiasm gave way to discipline because visibility had arrived. Through this phase, Ibrahim Traoré adjusted posture rather than direction. Public restraint paired with private acceleration. The objective was not confrontation, but continuity. Keep projects moving. Keep people protected. Keep alignment intact. That balance mattered, because momentum without control collapses, and control without momentum suffocates. By the end of this timeline, the story had shed any illusion of being a symbolic gesture. Too many resources were in motion. Too many people had reorganized their lives. Too many signals had been triggered across institutional landscapes that do not react to sentiment, only to threat or opportunity. What began as reconnection had become coordination. What looked like coordination was now exerting leverage. And leverage, once felt, invites response. At that point, the question was no longer whether the sequence could be reversed, it was who would adapt first, and who would discover too late that the ground beneath them had already shifted. The scale of this shift becomes clearer when emotion is set aside and baseline is compared to delta, before coordination and after momentum took hold. What once appeared as isolated ambition began producing measurable signals that could not be ignored. The first number defines scope. Within 6 months of initial outreach, 847 professionals across technology, medicine, finance, energy, education, and agriculture had entered active coordination. That figure matters because it crosses the threshold where networks stop behaving socially and start behaving structurally. At that size, redundancy appears, specialization deepens, and projects no longer depend on any single individual to survive. The second number captures speed. A virtual summit intended to last 2 hours extended to 11, driven not by speeches, but by sequential commitments. That extension signals compression. Decision cycles that typically stretch across quarters collapsed into a single day. In practical terms, this meant ideas were stress-tested immediately. Weaknesses surfaced in real time, and viable projects exited the room already staffed and financed. The third number anchors human impact. By the end of the first operational phase, commitments totaling approximately $340 million had been pledged toward energy, health, education, and infrastructure initiatives across multiple countries. This figure is not important as a headline, but as a proxy. It represents confidence translated into risk, and risk translated into shared exposure. People do not allocate capital at that scale unless they expect continuity. Viewed together, these numbers reveal pattern rather than coincidence. Before coordination, talent existed but remained siloed. Capital existed but moved cautiously. Trust existed but lacked channels. After coordination, those constraints loosened simultaneously. That simultaneity is the key insight. Systems rarely change because one variable improves. They change when several move at once. This is where Ibrahim Traoré becomes central again, not as a symbol, but as a stabilizing node. Leadership mattered less for vision than for sequencing. By maintaining quiet consistency while others accelerated, the network avoided fragmentation. That balance prevented early success from collapsing under its own visibility. The human dimension sharpens the picture further. Applications from professionals willing to relocate or commit long-term began arriving faster than projects could absorb them. Villages previously without electricity reported stable access for the first time. Medical facilities shifted from temporary outreach to permanent staffing. These outcomes are not abstract. They represent reduced friction in daily life, translated directly from coordinated effort. The weight of this evidence lies in what it disproves. It challenges the idea that reconnection is primarily emotional, that diaspora engagement is symbolic, or that capacity must always be imported through institutions. The numbers indicate that alignment alone unlocks dormant potential. By the end of this section, the conclusion becomes difficult to avoid. Once baseline isolation gave way to coordinated action, the system behaved differently, and when systems behave differently, they rarely revert simply because observers wish they would. At this point, it is necessary to slow down and acknowledge that credible objections exist, and that dismissing them would weaken rather than strengthen the analysis. Serious observers have raised concerns that deserve to be presented in their strongest form, not as strawmen, but as rational counterarguments. One common position argues that diaspora-driven coordination risks misunderstanding local realities. According to this view, professionals trained abroad may bring technical expertise, but lack the contextual knowledge required to operate effectively within African political, social, and regulatory environments. Well-intentioned projects, critics say, can stumble when imported assumptions collide with local constraints, producing inefficiency rather than progress. From this perspective, caution is not resistance, but responsibility. That concern carries weight, context matters, and history offers many examples where external enthusiasm outpaced on-the-ground capacity. Yet the evidence here complicates the claim. The coordination in question did not bypass local actors, it paired them. Projects were designed with shared leadership, not external command. Local engineers worked alongside returning specialists. Community needs shaped priorities before capital was deployed. The risk of misalignment was addressed structurally, not rhetorically. A second objection focuses on stability. Critics argue that linking development too closely to political leadership creates vulnerability. If conditions change, if leadership shifts, momentum could evaporate. From this angle, Long-term progress requires insulation from personalities, not alignment with them. Again, the concern is reasonable. Durable systems outlive individuals, but this critic overlooks where resilience actually formed. The network's durability did not rest on speeches or decrees, but on distributed commitments. Capital was diversified, expertise was redundant, decision-making was shared. Leadership functioned as a catalyst, not a bottleneck. Even if visibility shifted, the underlying relationships would remain intact. When these counter-arguments are placed alongside the observed outcomes, a clearer picture emerges. The objections highlight real risks, but they also reveal what has already been mitigated through design rather than denial. The issue is not whether risks exist, they always do. The question is whether the structure accounts for them. Seen this way, the debate does not invalidate the movement's logic, it clarifies it. Understanding both sides does not dilute the conclusion, it sharpens it. Everything tilted at once. What reframed the entire story was not a new project or a louder declaration, but the realization that resistance arrived before results were publicly visible. Pressure did not wait for outcomes. It appeared at the moment coordination became credible. The timing mattered. It revealed that the threat was never hypothetical success, but the possibility of alignment itself. Up to this point, reconnection could still be interpreted as aspiration. After this moment, it had to be treated as leverage. The scrutiny signaled that informal networks were already registering as formal influence. Their recognition shifted priorities. Speed alone was no longer enough. Protection, redundancy, and discretion became part of the architecture. This was where Ibrahim Traoré adjusted the frame. The focus moved from launching initiatives to hardening them. Less emphasis on announcement, more on survivability. Less attention on scale, more on durability. The objective quietly changed from proving that something new could begin to ensuring that it could not be easily undone. The midpoint insight was simple but destabilizing. The story was no longer about whether reconnection could work. It was about how systems react when long-separated capacities start behaving as one. From here on, every decision would be interpreted through that lens. And once that lens is applied, earlier events read differently. What seemed like beginnings now look like thresholds already crossed. After the midpoint shift, the effects stopped living in planning rooms and started showing up in daily reality. What had been discussed as strategy translated into consequences that different groups could feel, measure, and react to. The story moved from intent to impact. At the state level, pressure accumulated quickly. Governments were forced into faster decision cycles, not because of public demands, but because parallel systems were forming outside familiar channels. Regulatory questions surfaced earlier than expected. Diplomatic sensitivities sharpened. For leadership, including Ibrahim Traoré, this created a narrow path, maintain sovereignty while absorbing new forms of cooperation that did not fit traditional aid or partnership models. The consequence was heightened responsibility. When coordination accelerates, mistakes carry heavier costs, and hesitation carries its own risks. For businesses and organizations, the shift was economic and immediate. Supply chains began to reorient. Capital that once flowed outward hesitated, while new investment streams moved laterally across networks built on trust rather than branding. Some enterprises found opportunity in this realignment, gaining access to talent and markets that had previously felt distant. Others felt exposed. Competition increased, expectations rose, and passive advantage eroded. In practical terms, the environment became less forgiving to inefficiency. The most tangible effects appeared among ordinary people. Communities that had lived with intermittent services experienced continuity for the first time. Access to electricity, healthcare staffing, and technical training translated into changes that did not require explanation. Workdays extended, travel shortened, risk perception shifted. These were not abstract benefits. They altered how families planned, saved, and imagined the future. When systems stabilize, even modestly, psychological stress drops, and the change compounds quietly. Regionally and internationally, the ripple effects widened. Neighboring states observed outcomes rather than rhetoric. External actors recalculated influence based on emerging networks rather than formal agreements. The conversation subtly changed from whether reconnection was legitimate to how it would be managed. That shift matters because legitimacy is debated, but management is inevitable once effects become visible. Across all four layers, the same pattern held. No group remained untouched. Some adapted quickly, others resisted, but neutrality disappeared. The consequences forced positioning, whether acknowledged or not. Coordination had crossed the line where it could be ignored. By this stage, the story could no longer be reduced to leadership style or political narrative. It had entered the realm of a lived consequence. When outcomes distribute across institutions, markets, households, and borders, they signal a deeper transformation already underway, regardless of how it is labeled. The most probable path is not dramatic, but it is demanding. In this base scenario, coordination continues under constant pressure, neither collapsing nor accelerating uncontrollably. Projects mature unevenly. Some succeed quickly, others stall, and a few fail without taking the network down with them. Progress appears incremental rather than revolutionary. Stability improves in pockets, while friction persists elsewhere. From the outside, this can look underwhelming, but structurally, it is the scenario where habits change, trust compounds slowly, institutions adapt grudgingly, and alignment becomes normal rather than exceptional. This is the path where long-term influence is built quietly. The optimistic scenario requires discipline more than optimism. Here, early successes reinforce confidence without triggering overreach, feedback loops tighten, coordination improves faster than resistance adapts, talent circulates rather than concentrates, capital becomes patient rather than speculative. In this version, collaboration begins setting informal standards that others choose to follow because they work. The system does not expand explosively, but it becomes attractive. Over time, imitation replaces opposition. Gains are not just protected, they are replicated. This outcome depends on restraint, transparency, and an unusual tolerance for slow wins in a culture trained to celebrate rapid proof. The worst-case scenario does not arrive through failure alone, but through misjudgment. Visibility outpaces resilience. Symbolism overtakes structure. Internal trust erodes under external pressure. In this path, coordination fragments into competing efforts that drain energy instead of multiplying it. Capital retreats. Talent hesitates. Opponents do not need to dismantle the system. It exhausts itself. The damage is not only material. Cynicism returns, stronger than before, because expectations were raised and then unmet. Recovery from this outcome would take longer than the original separation did to form. The important insight is that none of these scenarios is predetermined. They are shaped by sequencing, restraint, and response to pressure. The future hinges less on bold declarations than on boring decisions made consistently. Preparation does not mean choosing the most appealing path. It means recognizing the costs embedded in each one and acting with enough clarity to avoid drifting into the worst by default. After the scale, the timelines, and the scenarios are clear, the question narrows to something more immediate. Where does this leave you? The person listening, not as an observer of history, but as someone living inside its consequences. Understanding a structural shift only matters if it changes how you locate yourself within it. For those who already pay close attention, who track global patterns and power dynamics, this story offers an advantage but also a warning. Awareness creates lead time, yet it can also create false confidence. Staying informed is not enough if information is treated as entertainment. The value lies in watching signals, not headlines, and noticing when coordination quietly outpaces noise. For those affected indirectly, through work, markets, or social pressure, the impact is subtler but no less real. Changes like these alter opportunity landscapes before they announce themselves. Expectations shift, competition intensifies, stability becomes uneven. Preparation here is not dramatic. It means adjusting assumptions, building flexibility, and recognizing that what felt distant yesterday may shape decisions sooner than expected. For those who feel detached, convinced that this has little to do with their lives, the risk is not ignorance, but delay. Structural change does not ask for permission before it reaches individuals. By the time effects feel personal, options are usually narrower. Paying minimal attention now is less costly than reacting under pressure later. Across all three groups, the common thread is agency. No one is required to take sides, relocate, or commit to causes. But understanding what is unfolding reduces vulnerability to surprise. It replaces confusion with context. Whether you engage deeply or simply stay alert, grasping this story places you ahead of its consequences rather than behind them. And in periods of transition, that position alone carries quiet power. Solutions here cannot live as slogans, because the pressure revealed earlier punishes vagueness. What works must specify who acts, what changes, when it happens, and how progress is judged. Otherwise, momentum leaks away. At the leadership level, the first task is insulation. That means separating coordination from short-term politics by locking in continuity mechanisms early. Ibrahim Traoré's role at this stage is not expansion, but stabilization, clarifying mandates, protecting participants, and pacing visibility. The time horizon is immediate to 12 months. Success is measured not by announcements, but by uninterrupted operation and the absence of forced reversals. For organizations and enterprises, the second step is execution discipline. Projects must move from pilot to routine without scaling theatrics. Responsibility sits with managers and boards, not figureheads. The work is practical, align compliance, local partnerships, and cash flow, so initiatives can survive scrutiny. This phase runs concurrently over the next 1 to 2 years. Progress is measured by repeatability, staff retention, and financial self-sufficiency rather than growth headlines. At the community and individual level, the third step is participation without dependency. People closest to outcomes must have ownership, not observer status. That means training pipelines, shared governance, and transparent decision rules. The timeline here is continuous. Measurement is behavioral, skills transfer completed, roles localized, and decisions made without external prompting. If additional leverage is needed, regional cooperation becomes the fourth layer. This is not about uniformity, but interoperability, aligning standards, sharing lessons, and reducing friction across borders extends resilience. The metric is coordination cost, how much time and effort it takes to work together compared to before. The closing principle is simple: strategy matters, but execution decides. Alignment only reshapes power when it is maintained long after attention fades. Without that discipline, even the strongest opening collapses back into noise. The guide introduced earlier returns quietly here, not as a strategist or a leader, but as a reference point for how far the story has traveled. What began as recognition turned into coordination, and coordination into consequences that now sit in real lives rather than abstract plans. The distance between those moments is shorter than it appears. Placed against that arc, the journey feels heavier. Early uncertainty gave way to risk. Risk gave way to commitment. Commitment demanded endurance. Along the way, expectations were stripped down to what could survive pressure, leaving behind only what people were willing to protect. That progression is easy to overlook unless the full path is held in view. This is where meaning settles, not in declarations or outcomes alone, but in the shift from isolation to shared responsibility. Ibrahim Traoré's role fades slightly here, not because it matters less, but because the story no longer rests on one figure. What persists is the realization that reconnection, once acted upon, changes how people see their own capacity and their tolerance for fragmentation. The emotional weight lies in that recognition. Something long treated as symbolic proved operational. Something long dismissed as impractical proved durable. And once that knowledge exists, it does not vanish easily. The final note is simple and difficult at once. When separation stops feeling inevitable, choice becomes visible. And when choice appears, responsibility follows, whether welcomed or not. That is the point the story leaves behind. What you take from this story does not need to look the same as what someone else takes from it. Reflection itself is a form of participation. If the sequence you have just heard sharpened your understanding, that awareness already has value, even before it turns into action. If you believe this perspective helps others see beyond headlines and emotion, consider letting it travel further, not as persuasion, but as context. Conversations grounded in clarity tend to outlast those driven by outrage. Quiet sharing builds quieter communities of thought. If you choose to respond, do so as dialogue rather than declaration. What part of this story felt most consequential to you? Where did it challenge your assumptions? What questions did it leave unresolved? These are the signals that matter more than agreement. Figures like Ibrahim Traoré appear in this account not as endpoints, but as catalysts. Reminders that decisions can shift trajectories when timing and alignment meet. Ibrahim Traoré's presence matters less than the broader pattern his actions revealed. The door this story points to is not dramatic. It is open because people are willing to keep it open together.